Chapter 15. Throw in a curveball. The greatest glory in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Nelson Mandela. It was the morning of the 28th of February 2002, and the twins were nearly 9, Mitch was 3, and Charlotte was 18 months old. Emma would have just had her 11th birthday. Our home was always like a busy train station on a school day. Once the twins went off to school, I would set Mitchell and Charlotte up in the lounge with a Thomas the Tank Engine or hi-fi video, while I briefly scanned the Otago Daily Times and had my 3rd or 4th cup of half-cold tea. For some reason, I could never finish one, and I was forever finding half-drunk cups of tea in the lounge or the bedroom. That morning, when I unfolded the paper, the bold headline on the front page stopped me in my tracks. Usually I would turn to the back of the page first to read Matched, Hatched and Dispatched, Births, Deaths and Marriages. The headline read, Hospitals legally entitled to keep hearts, says expert. Green Lane Hospital, New Zealand's premier heart facility, yesterday revealed it had kept about 1,350 hearts from babies and children in a heart library. The collection began in 1950. Most of the hearts had been taken from the bodies of children who died of congenital heart disease. There were also a few adult hearts. At the time, parental or caregiver consent to retain hearts was not seen as an issue, partly because most of the hearts were removed for post-mortems, and it was within the coroner's jurisdiction for the heart to be retained for detailed examination by a pathologist. At that point, I couldn't read on. I thought I was going to be sick. My ears started ringing and I thought I was going to pass out. Oh, no. Don't tell me they could possibly have Emma's heart. I slowly stood up. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I sat down again because I felt faint. I tried to keep reading, but my eyes could not focus. I needed to calm down and take some breaths. My legs felt like jelly. Mitchell and Charlotte were completely oblivious as to what was happening to me, and I was scared that I would pass out, and then for them to find their mummy passed out on the floor. It would scare the living daylights out of them. I started taking in deep breaths. Once I felt I was in control, I walked outside. I needed air. Oh my goodness, my thoughts were going 100 miles an hour. Don't tell me after all this time they have Emma's heart. I told myself to calm down. Surely they would have asked me if they wanted to take her heart for further investigation. It took me at least another hour until I could get a grip of myself to continue reading the article. It continued. Abbreviated. Green Lane reviewed its heart library last year after an inquiry in Britain due to a scandal involving a hospital that retained thousands of body parts without consent. The hospital last year formed a steering group, which includes parents, representatives and iwi, to ensure the collection was managed appropriately and hearts were not being kept against relatives' wishes. Green Lane had admitted taking the hearts of over 1,000 babies or children without consents for research purposes. Dr. Finn Ukane said since the late 1980s, there had been a greater awareness of consent issues. While a process for seeking consent had not been formalised, she was sure in most cases consent to keep body parts would have been sought. She said that the steering group knew that it was wrong to take the hearts without consent. We all regret the grief that we have caused people who are going to find this out and be very upset by it, she told National Radio. But it was the practice of the day when a post-mortem was done to remove the organs at times and to get a detailed examination. Without that, we couldn't get the correct feedback to the family as to what the cause of death was. Health Minister Annette King said today that it was too early to say if an official inquiry was needed into the organ controversy. She said that before 1996, there were no proper legal consents for hospitals to follow. She wanted to make sure that consent to take organs was sought by authorities after 1996. Green Lane's library was credited with enabling New Zealand surgeons to make major advances in heart surgery, saving the lives of many children with heart disease. As far fewer children or babies now died from heart complications, only a few hearts were collected with parental permission each year. Dr. Finucane said the hearts were all documented and it would not be difficult to confirm whose hearts had been kept right back until 1950. Green Party health spokeswoman Sue Kedgley said there should be a ministerial inquiry into how the babies' hearts were removed without their parents' consent and stored in the library. There are incredibly serious ethical and informed consent issues that need to be addressed if we are to avoid a repetition of this bizarre and tragic episode. Ms. Kedgley said in a statement, "It was almost unbelievable that after the Cartwright inquiry, a hospital had knowingly extracted hearts from babies and stored them for research without first getting permission from the parents." I sat in silence, stunned. There was a very high chance that they could have Emma's heart, as she was a one-off case. At the bottom of the article was a hotline number to call if you thought there was a possibility the hospital could be holding your child's heart. After reading the article, I wandered around in a daze and caught myself shaking and crying. I attempted to ring Neil, but each time I picked up the phone, I couldn't get any words out. It was like reliving Emma's death all over again. You may be justified in thinking that even though these actions were unethical, it did help save babies' lives. But that wasn't the point. It was that it was underhanded, deceitful, and it was done in secret. They had stolen parts of our precious babies. I'm all for research, for medical advancement, don't get me wrong, and there's a strong possibility that if we were asked if they could keep Emma's heart for medical research, we would have granted it. However, right at this moment, it was hard to get my head around this news. I waited until Neil arrived home that evening. I still couldn't speak. I heard gravel crunching under the tyres of the car and went to meet Neil at the door. I handed him the paper. His eyes met my eyes. He could tell by looking at my facial expression and red eyes that something had rocked my world. He was just as dumbfounded as I was. I had 3 attempts ringing the hotline number and each time had to hang up due to crying so hard that I couldn't talk. It was a story that shocked the nation. Many parents were not aware hearts or other organs were retained after autopsies of their children or aborted fetuses. Almost 3,000 people had called the hotline and just under 40 people had been told that their child's organs had been retained. The following news articles that appeared in the Dunedin Otago Daily Times makes interesting reading. Front page, Otago Daily Times, Friday, the 1st of March 2002. 34 years after her baby son died at Green Lane Hospital, long-serving Otago Daily Times Alexandra reporter Diane King is waiting to hear if the hospital has kept his heart. She prays it did not. It starts off saying, "My heart aches, not just for our family, but for every other parent who is waiting to hear whether their baby's heart has been stored without their knowledge at the Green Lane Hospital, Auckland." As parents, Brian and I are in a state of limbo, just like the one we experienced 34 years ago, waiting to hear back from Green Lane about our baby's heart. Yesterday morning I rang the 0800 number. There was still a queue, but about 10:30 I made contact at least. The cardiac paediatrician liaison nurse, Heather, was warm and caring as she took the details, explaining the news broke earlier than expected, although the hospital knew a documentary was being made. But we wait again because it will be Monday before we know whether we buried all our baby son in Roxburgh Cemetery days into the new year in 1968. Today, for thousands of parents like us, old wounds are open, heart aches and tears flow as memories flood, and of the empty arms feeling only parents who lose a child will probably understand. Why was I standing in the shower crying yesterday morning? On December the 4th, 1967, Matthew David Wade King was born in Roxburgh Hospital where his brothers had arrived in earlier years. I never got to hold this newborn babe in my arms. He was whisked away into Dunedin Hospital within an hour of his birth, and days later he was flown to Green Lane Hospital, Auckland. For 3 weeks we waited. 2 days after Christmas, our wonderful parents paid the airfares and took our 2 children, and we flew to Auckland to be there for our tiny son, managing to sneak our cuddles the night before his operation. I don't need to shut my eyes to see surgeon Mr. Brian Barrett Boys and a colleague gently saying our baby had only a 40 to 60% chance of surviving the operation. Hours later, we are back because Matthew did not survive. But these 2 men were wonderful, explaining that when they opened him up, his tiny little heart was worse than what they thought. It was in reverse order. As we heard the news of the heart bank on television on Wednesday night, Brian said, "Would they keep it because they told us his was so bad?" As a mother, I've a dilemma. As a father, so has Brian. Because as parents, if his heart is still at Green Lane, what decision will we make on Monday? Please God, were we among the lucky ones? Because we're not trying to think about burying his heart 34 years later, and we're sad the hospital, which had shown compassion to 2 young parents from Central Otago, has found itself in this position. We were distressed parents when his operation failed, the only consolation being the surgeon's assurances every operation helped another child, which was and has been for 34 years a comfort to us. So we wait again, grateful for the 3 healthy children we've had since, plus 6 little grandies, including Benjamin Matthew King, who takes the name after another generation, but my heart still aches. The next article, featured on the same day, introduced the article headline with "Worried Parents Flood Switchboard" by Joanna Norris and NZPA. Otago parents were among hundreds of people who flooded Green Lane Hospital switchboard with calls yesterday fearing body parts from their children had been retained by the Auckland Hospital. The hospital, home to the country's top cardiac facilities, this week admitted it had a library of more than 1,300 hearts collected from patients, mainly children with congenital heart diseases dating back to the 1950s. Green Lane paediatric cardiologist Dr. Nigel Wilson told the Otago Daily Times that until the 1990s it was likely the hearts were retained without consent. But from 1992, for anyone who died at Green Lane, we had a consent process in place, and the intent was to get it, but it's still possible there have been cases where there has not been consent, he said. Dr. Wilson said the hospital was advising people it would probably be up to a week before it could confirm whether or not it had the children's heart. In terms of privacy, we have to have a way of knowing the person making an inquiry is a relative of the person who died. Then we have to check against the records to see if the heart is there. If the answer is no, it's pretty straightforward, but if it is a yes, we have to double check. It emerged yesterday that hundreds of abnormal hearts stored at the hospital were taken from aborted fetuses. At first, Green Lane said the hearts were mainly from children and babies. But yesterday, the hospital's clinical director of children's heart surgery, Dr. Kirsten Finucane, said many were from aborted fetuses. Because of legal worries, the hospital would not seek to contact the woman involved, who may have had secret abortions. The hospital had received more than 500 calls from relatives of people concerned the hospital had body parts from their dead children. One Dunedin woman who did not want to be named said she waited on hold for more than 4 hours and was unable to get through. The news has prompted the Ministry of Health to advise hospitals that any body parts held should be released to families if possible. Ministry Deputy Director General of Clinical Services, Dr. Colin Feek, said some hospitals and medical schools kept body parts for teaching or research purposes. The organisation responsible for these collections should review from time to time to see if they are still required. If body parts are no longer required, they should be made available to relatives who are able to bury or cremate them, he said in a statement. Otago Medical School pathology head Dr. Colin Geary said, "For the past 15 years, no body parts had been taken from patients without consent. But before 1988, where consent was given for an autopsy, it allowed medical practitioners to take parts to confirm diagnosis, to use in teaching students for therapeutic purposes such as the extraction of growth hormones and for research. Then, the Human Tissues Act changed entirely, and the permission of the next of kin had to be sought. But even under the old regime, the tissues were returned to the body," he said. He said the medical school had a small museum with specimens dating back 100 years. However, he said it was appropriate the school retain the material for teaching. Otago District Board Chief Executive Bill Adam said Dunedin Hospital did not retain body parts without specific consent. However, if anyone had concerns about the issue in relation to Dunedin Hospital, they should contact the hospital's Patients Affairs Department. People with concerns in relation to Green Lane Hospital should contact them. Article 3, Otago Daily Times, Friday, March the 1st, 2002. Matters of the Heart. Revelations that children's hearts have been kept at Green Lane Hospital for research purposes without the consent of parents is immensely upsetting to many families. Taking body parts or conducting clinical research without families' consent is not acceptable today. That had been made plain for a decade or more by changing societal attitudes and official findings, not least among those of the Cartwright inquiry. To its credit, Green Lane is doing all it can now to reassure the families concerned and is making arrangements to have the body parts returned if that is the family's wishes. Senior Green Lane clinicians are also at pains to point out that such practices are no longer carried out at the hospital, and Health Minister Annette King has moved promptly to reassure the public that they are not carried out elsewhere in New Zealand. Similar reassurances should be forthcoming from the country's medical bodies, particularly for parents and grandparents throughout the country who will be incredulous that such practices should have happened here at all. But while we can understand the high emotions and reopening of old wounds that the Green Lane disclosures bring, the context in which this scandal has occurred must be remembered. Green Lane's Heart Library consists of some 1,350 hearts, mainly those of children with congenital deformities, collected since 1950 and preserved for research purposes at the country's top hospital. Following a similar scandal in Britain, the Green Lane Hospital began a review last year of its library contents. The hospital formed a heart steering group which includes parent representatives and iwi to check the collection was being managed appropriately and that the hearts were not being kept against relatives' wishes. They found some families had no idea they had not buried all of their babies. It should be remembered that awareness of parents' rights and consent issues now is vastly different to that it was 50 or even 30 years ago. The babies' hearts at Green Lane and other human tissue were collected then for research purposes in a paternalistic atmosphere. Patients and their families were passive and trusting recipients of care. Most knew little of the concept of consent, let alone consent procedures, and they really questioned medical decisions. That babies' hearts were taken and kept without parents' knowledge does not mean that all doctors 50 years ago were perverse. That was normal procedure then. Simply, the world has changed. That partly as a result of some shocking cases of medical abuse here and overseas. Strict ethical guidelines and reviews are in place. No medical research can be contemplated without the consent of the donor or their next of kin, unless subject to proper ethical review. That is the way it should be, judged by today's standards and morals. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Green Lane disclosure, however, is that it appears babies' hearts were being taken without consent, or at least using faulty consent procedures, as late as 1996, well after the Cartwright inquiry had established the principle that no research should be carried out without proper informed consent. Some clarification and reform of our laws may be needed, particularly aspects of the Human Tissue Act of 1964. But patients and families are protected by more recent legislation, including the Code of Rights and the Health and Disability Commission Act, where emphasis on consent is prominent. Generally, contemporary medical training is also inculcating these values, so that there is clearly a commitment to ethical review among the medical profession. The distress and grief that the Green Lane revelations cause will vary from family to family. The nation's indignation at such practices is fully justified. For the public, perhaps already sceptical about research in general, it's imperative that practitioners everywhere move swiftly to reassure the public that a new set of values is in place and that medical research is no longer conducted without consent. Article 4, Otago Daily Times. Friday, the 1st of March 2002. No sample since 1990s without consent. By Joanna Norris and NZPA. Modern ethical practice should have prevented the retention of babies' hearts at Green Lane Hospital, says Otago University bioethics head Professor Donald Evans. Professor Evans, a member of the National Ethics Committee, said there were clear ethical guidelines that should have prevented samples being collected without consent after the 1980s. His comments come after news that about 1,300 hearts had been stored at Green Lane Hospital. In the past, the paternalistic approach of hospitals was accepted as the norm, but things have changed hugely in the last 20 to 30 years, and we are no longer living in a time where patients are seen as research fodder. He said revelations in the 1980s that women were the subjects of cervical cancer study at the National Women's Hospital had helped shape ethical policy, and the Cartwright inquiry in 1988 set guidelines for informed consent. The guidelines were clear that no research should be done on humans without consent. What has happened since 1990 is particularly disturbing. What happened before was not right, but one can understand what was going on. But it is hard to understand, post-Cartwright, that any patient was used in this way without consent. New Zealand Medical Association Chairman Dr. John Adams of Dunedin said that while the retained hearts had helped advance medical research, it was disturbing to hear some had been taken without consent. Otago University medical professor Peter Skegg, who has provided advice to Green Lane Hospital, said the hearts may have been collected legally. He said the Health Tissue Act makes provision for the prevention of organs for science and according to the law, the Act did not require the consent of relatives. End of newspaper article. I finally found the courage to pick up the phone and ring the hotline number and snuffled my way through the questions. They were asked by a lovely person at the end of the phone. It was now a waiting game. For me, I wasn't handling it very well at all. I just went into this depressive state. It was as if a big black cloud was hovering over me and I couldn't shake it. It took all my might and energy to function and carry on, looking after my wee family. The waiting was excruciating. I found myself in a constant fog and a state of anxiety. I was grateful for a friend who saw the situation that I was in and knew that this was something I could not deal on my own or shake myself out of it. I needed medical help. I rang the doctor's rooms and made an appointment to discuss my situation with my GP. My visit with Dr. Astrid Winfer. Dr. Astrid Winfer had been my new GP since the twins were approximately 18 months old. She was always attentive, kind and understanding. She never knew about our first baby Emma, as there was never seemed to be the occasion for it to be discussed at previous doctor's appointments with myself or when I was with the children. I told her my story about our beautiful Emma and how the news in the paper about the Heart Library had set me into a spin. The waiting to know if they had taken her heart for research purposes was doing my head in. After listening to my story and seeing the state I was in, she gave me some medication to deal with anxiety and depression and said that she would make inquiries on my behalf as to what happened to Emma's autopsy and ask for a copy of the report. On obtaining the report, she would ring me and go through it with me. I can't remember how long it took to find out the results, but I do remember my GP ringing me to say that she had the report and that Emma's heart had not been taken for medical research. I burst into tears. I was so relieved. She invited me to make an hour appointment with her and would go through the report with me. I was so grateful to have a kind and caring doctor through a very difficult time.